Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm so glad that I can join you virtually. I'm Dr. Lori Moore-Merrell, and again, thank you for the invitation. I'm here today to talk with you about using data as we look at modern construction. How can we assess risk, not only for the community, but for the firefighters in light of modern construction? And so to begin that, I'd like to give you a little bit of background on who I am and who the International Public Safety Data Institute is. So we are a nonprofit research and data science organization from a collaboration of fire service organizations. And we have lots of partners as part of our collaboration, not the least of which is IFE. So we're so glad to have IFE as a supporting partner as we move forward looking at data within the fire service. Our mission at IPSDI is really, as I said, research and data science. So as part of that, we try to work with fire departments to better understand your data locally, to understand your community risk, your built environment, all of those aspects that really contribute to the risk environment and potentially to the health and safety and well-being, not only of the community, but of firefighters as well. We have always worked around a list of fire department core values. In fact, the Institute, though we are only about 2 years old, we have been together. Those partners, many of them our research partners, have been together for nearly 18 years. And so this collaboration is not new, though the Institute is new. But our work has always been focused around these core values, and I'm sure many of these you will recognize. Everything from preparedness to prevention, public education, and certainly emergency response. Always, always, with the emphasis on not only quality of services to the community, but safe, efficient, and effective. Those three criteria really continue to drive everything that we do, and I hope everything that you do. And so we'll be referring back to those throughout the presentation today. So as we get through and begin to talk about the built environment a little bit, I want to bring in one of our data tools, because looking at the built environment is one of the major aspects of dealing with community risk assessment. And so one of our data tools, I think, does this well. And as I begin to talk with you just a little bit about what type of constructions are in your community, the age of the structures, the type of construction, all of those things matter to risk. And so we have built in our Fire Cares tool, this was relevant to us. And so having that as a baseline is important. So we began to leverage real estate data, tax assessment data, and certainly looking at NFPA hazard levels by definition. And so what you see on your screen now is a screenshot from our Fire Cares, and Fire Cares just stands for Community Assessment Response Evaluation System. And when we start talking about data in light of construction types, this is certainly something we want to consider. And so looking at this data and how it's presented, and what you're seeing visually there is a community that has been not only color coded, but those colors represent hazard levels. And so we have a good deal of information, as I said, from these three sources that really inform the built environment. And so the green on the screen there represents more of your low hazard, smaller single family type dwellings. Then we have the peach color, or there's a bit of orange there. That is more of your medium hazard, more of your 3-story garden apartments, that sort of environment. And then of course the high hazard is going to be our high rises, hospitals, schools, larger universities, these types of commercial based structures, or even high rise residential. And so having that understanding of the built environment in your community matters. Now let's take it a step further, because we can find data that informs us even more about that built environment. Looking at your specific structure types, whether it is your masonry, heavy timber, wood frame, modern, what year they were built, how many rooms, any improvements that have been done. There are data sources available that can inform this kind of information. This all plays into your risk assessment. And so at the end of the day, when we talk about data and modern construction, what we're really talking about is information about the risk environment into which your firefighters will be responding. It's the risk environment in which people live. And so this is where we began to really drill down in some of the data. And so in our system, what we have built, and perhaps you'll look at building in the future, is this type of detail about each of the structures. And so simply we've got an interactive dashboard where we can literally scroll across, and these types of information will populate. So the data are there. It's a matter of assembling them and making them usable. With that, what's the next data element that's going to inform us as we go through? Well, that's going to be your historic fires. We need to know where fire has occurred in your community in the past. And so with that, looking at your fire data as another data source, geocoding that, and then overlaying that with your community. So you can form these heat maps, and perhaps some of you already do this, looking at where you've had historic fire, because there's a good bit of information there that is predictive of future events. And that again plays into our built environment and the community risk. So let's keep digging. We're going to sort of, if you'll go along with me here, we're going to create sort of this tapestry that we begin to layer all of this data. So we started with our built environment, we overlay historic fires, and we keep going a bit deeper as we continue to overlay information and then mine it for the information that you need. So when we talk about community risk, we've looked at the expected number of fires based on historic fire. We can even look at the expected size of those fires, again, based on what we've seen in the built environment, what type of structures did they have, the risk of fire, the expected fire, the size of fire spread, and then the likelihood of injury and death. Again, from the historic fires, we can predict somewhat what we're looking at going forward. So the community risk then, let's add that to our built environment and our historic fire data. So when we start to look at community risk, these are really based on your socio-demographic profiles, the structures, which we've already mentioned, including the modern construction, and then the pattern and number of those fires. And so these three elements, the profile of the community, built environment, and the historic fires, are all layers that we need to be able to look at community risk. With that, I want to elaborate just a little bit on the fire itself, because I want you to think about the fire data you have. Does the data that you have include fire spread? Now, that's relevant, isn't it, to particularly in the built environment. Which type of structures have greater fire spread with time and with fire load, the fuel load in the structure itself? And so fire spread really does inform us very well about risk. And so if we were to categorize fire spread and the data elements that go along with that, we would be looking at room of origin. Were you able to stop, or was the fire stopped at the room of origin? The floor of origin, when you have a multi-floor structure, and then beyond the structure. Those are three categories, right? Can we stop it in the room? Can we stop it on the floor of origin? Or did we have it go or spread beyond the structure itself to a neighboring structure, right? So these are aspects or perspectives of fire spread that we need to discuss. And so when we look at historic fires, we certainly want to know, are this type of data available about those historic fires? That's important because it's incredibly informative going forward, particularly when you overlay that information with your type of structures or built environment. And so as we look at that, you might lay that out on some sort of distribution if you are dealing with your own data, the number of fires, and then looking at fire spread. And so you're able to better characterize, what's our distribution? Look at your fire spread in the context of just the spread itself. Then we can perhaps geocode that, go back and overlay it over our historic fires, over the structures, and know where we're seeing the most fire spread, even by type of structure. And so fire spread is certainly relevant to the conversation. A little bit more on how we look at not only fire spread, but fire growth overall, right? And time enters the picture, doesn't it? When we start to talk about, again, data, then time becomes an element. And so as we've gone through some of the other layers, we're going to now add time as a data element. So overall growth time, we look at the time of alarm, right? When the call came in, your call processing, your dispatch, your turnout, your arrival time, and then time to suppression. All of those time elements contribute to fire growth. Now, when I say contribute, it means that it's taking place in parallel, right? Until we have suppression, we continue, as long as there's a fuel load and oxygen, we've got fire growth. And so we look at this and we have to consider this in our model for looking at community risk assessment, and we're about to add the element of response. So when we're dealing with data, we're going to take in all of those aspects that we discussed earlier, particularly around emergency response. And so fire growth and the time elements are certainly data elements that we need to bring in. Now, putting this in perspective, obviously our fire size is relevant to the time, the fire ground time, and then that the aspect of the growth time really has to do with where we intercede with extinguishment or suppression. And so growth time matters, and then we can overlay that information again over our built environment because we've got that data from a different data set. And this all begins to tell a story, doesn't it? It helps you to have these kinds of insights for looking forward, and how do we plan then going forward, given our construction types, given our community risk that exists, and given our historic fire growth. It really does give us some insights going forward. So now I want to take you to where we have some guidance. You see, when we can begin to be informed from the data itself, then we can begin to formulate some structure, some guidance in our standards. And so I'm going to focus for a moment on NFPA 1710 standard, which is an operational standard. And it does now, the new 2020 revision, if you have not seen that, does include a definition of community risk assessment. And so I want you just to look at this definition, because I think from a data perspective, this really does give you some guidance. Your systematic approach that is going to identify, assess, categorize, and classify not only the probabilities, but the consequences of fire, right? Fire hazards, fire threats, looking at all of those pertinent facts, those data elements that help us to increase or decrease the risk within an area in our community. And that area is no longer your community at whole. You know, in the past, when we've looked at risk assessment, we've done it on the community as a whole. Well, now for the first time, we are understanding that we need to break that down in a much smaller data element, a much smaller area of analysis, and that is what we're going to call our first due response zone. Now, this is something that you're very familiar with. You are all very familiar with what is our first due response zone. So it's that geographic area immediately surrounding a station that helps us to understand that in that area, the apparatus or the units responding from that station are anticipated to be the first on scene in that geographic area, right? So that is the definition of a first due response zone. Now, if we better understand all of these elements of community risk in our first due response zones, that's going to give us great information for being able to then better plan our response as a whole. And so this is our element of measure and how we're going to be looking at all those different data elements distributed, not community-wide necessarily, but more focused in a response zone. And so given that, we are then able to hazard code or look at risk levels of the built environment in that response zone. So I would say to you, if you look at, station 1, station 5, what is in their first due response zone from a construction standpoint? What type of buildings are there? Are they low hazard, medium hazard, high hazard? What type of construction? Right? All of these things that we've gone through, but if I hone it down and ask that question just about your first due response areas, now you're better able to focus. And so we can start looking at this information. And I know you've had an earlier presentation even on built suppression within the buildings, right? Sprinklers. And so I would say to you, that's another element for consideration and risk, right? So are the buildings sprinkled? Those are the kinds of things that we want to ask, but we want to ask them in a much smaller bite in those first due response zones. And certainly what type of occupancies are they? Is it a single family? Is it more of a commercial? Is it a high-rise residential? What are we looking at in the types of occupancies as well? So with that, we have continued guidance within NFPA 1710. And part of that continued guidance does identify for us the response force that we need to deploy by hazard level. And so if we look at, and I'm going to take you back to that core value, and I said to you there were three elements: safe, efficient, and effective, right? Well, efficient certainly has to do with sending, as few resources as possible, being very efficient with our response. Effective means, what do you do when you show up? Does it matter? But safe is the third one. Not only safe for the community, but safe for our responders. And so there is an effective response force that is considered to be the baseline, the floor, not the ceiling, but the baseline for response by hazard level. And so given that I now have information about my built environment by first due response zone, about my community profile, and we're going to talk more about your community profile and that data in just a moment, but I can look at the type of response and how large of a response I need to send or deploy as the floor, not the ceiling. So this is the absolute baseline minimum looking at the hazard level. And so in our 1710 standard, it tells us that in the low hazard, that's single family, no more than 2,000 square feet, we're looking at deploying minimally 16 firefighters. At the medium, 27, and at the high hazard level, 42 in that initial alarm assignment. And so that's what we consider an effective response force, or this matching resources deployed to the risk environment. And that's critical to understand. Because if I don't match well my resources that are deployed to the risk environment to which they are responding, if I send too few, or if I don't send them quickly enough, and it takes them a long time to assemble, all of these things are happening while you are having continued fire growth. Remember, we talked about the time, right? So until I can intervene with an appropriate number of firefighters on scene, then that fire growth is continuing. Our risk is continuing. And so all of these things play together, and understanding these data elements and how they play into you planning that safe, efficient, and effective response. Because again, if I don't match well firefighters deployed in the appropriate number in the appropriate time frame to the hazard level to which they are responding, given it be modern construction or any other type of hazard, then I'm much more vulnerable, much more likely to have negative impact, negative outcome in firefighter injury and death, civilian injury and death, and property loss. If I don't match well resources deployed to the risk environment into which they're responding, I'll say it again, much more vulnerable to firefighter injury and death, civilian injury and death, and property loss. And so as we continue on talking about data, that effective response force matters. And so we try to help communities measure that. Have you measured where you can assemble enough firefighters for a low hazard structure fire? How about a strip mall or a 3-story garden apartment, or even a high-rise event? So understanding your metrics and your deployment capability in a fire department is critical. And so this map and what you're seeing, I'm going to break it down for you a little bit more. So I'm going to show you now just a low hazard response. So if I look at, and this is Fairfax County, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. in the U.S., and we're looking at where can they deploy and arrive with 15 firefighters in less than 8 minutes, because we've now applied that time factor. And so where can they assemble 15 firefighters to fight a structure fire in less than 8 minutes assembly time so that they can engage? And so these metrics or performance metrics are in that NFPA 1710 standard. And so you can see that they can do that in 77% of their community at the addresses where they have low hazard structures, because we know where those structures are. How about medium hazard structures? Again, strip malls, 3-story garden apartments, or medium hazard, they can assemble at only 60% coverage capability, where they can gather 27 plus firefighters in less than 8 minutes. for a medium hazard structure fire. And then high hazard, about 13%, delivering at least 38 firefighters. The 42 in the standard includes your emergency medical response units. So it's 38 firefighters and at least 2 ambulances with 2 each. And so looking at where you have that kind of effective response force deployment capability, given the hazard level, matters. How can I match it? And knowing and understanding where you have that deployment capability also matters. So as we continue on, it's important that you understand not only your station location, obviously, in those first 2 areas, but also what rides out of each station. Is it an engine with 4, or pump with 4? Is it a ladder or an aerial truck with 4? What is your minimum staffing? Is it with 5? How do I assemble from each station the capability to respond and assemble resources from multiple stations, obviously, on certain types of fire by hazard level? I told you we talk a little bit more about your community risk by adding another data element. So we've got our baseline structures by hazard level. We've looked at our historic fires. We've looked at fire spread capability historically. And now I want to add that community profile, because this matters too. There are elements about your community that actually drive call volume. Some of these may be the age of your population, whether it is young or very old. It can also be contributing factors like ethnicity, multiple languages, not understanding languages. You can have even your household composition, level of education, all of these things. Once you begin to drill down, you can see that they can actually contribute or are contributors to call volume. And so we can then identify where we have hotspots. So if I understand my population and I overlay it again with that call volume that we talked about earlier, are there hotspots from a call volume perspective that I can better identify, and then begin to talk about community risk reduction? Because if we can better distribute smoke alarms, if we can better advocate for sprinklered buildings where we know we have vulnerable populations, right? So this data helps inform us. Again, another layer of information as we add data to our tapestry. So looking at, for example, here's some high utilizer addresses. So this is a community. You can actually see the addresses listed there. And what you can do is, once we understand where you've got high utilizers, like you deploy crews to a particular address multiple times a year, you need to be able to pull that data out and have a look at it. What type of structure is that? What hazard level is it? What type of community? Right? All of these factors, what is contributing to you sending resources multiple times a year to that particular address? And so this is another way to identify, where are we having increased hazards and risk, even to that safe, efficient, and effective, response criteria. And so you can see, if we couple this with data about the community, I can see my over 65 population. I can look at the percent poverty. We can even look at disabled individuals and the ethnicity as well, race and ethnicity. And so looking at all of those types of factors, can we identify where we're having contributing factors to that response? And so begin to intervene again with community risk reduction along the way. Also, being able to sort your data by details is important. How many of you could sort your response data right now by battalion? I hope a lot of you, right? Can you begin to visualize by battalion where you have a breakdown? Because that's going to get you of your calls, because that's going to get you down to that first due area discussion, right? And where we may respond differently by first due areas. So the battalion is the first one. How about by shift? Looking at performance, whether it's turnout time, those sorts of things. That's just another way of analyzing your data. Or how about your geopolitical boundaries, whether it is a city council or some sort of municipal governmental jurisdiction? Can you break your data down by decision maker? These are areas that you should be able to analyze, because again, as we layer the data and they want to know about modern construction in their jurisdiction, you should be able to parse out your data or filter your data by that attribute as well. So given that, I just want to wrap up here a bit. We talked about a lot today in layering your data, looking first of all at our built environment to include obviously modern construction, hazard levels, our community profile and how that contributes to call volume and risk, our response capabilities, fire growth. All of these different things play in with all of those different layers of our tapestry that really do look at that safe, efficient, and effective response capability. But at the end of the day, one of the things that I want you to take away from this particular presentation is that we really have to emphasize matching our deployment capability to the hazard level or the risk levels that are inherent in that response in our community. So matching resources deployed, your firefighters, to the risk event to which they are responding is so important. Understanding the data on both sides of that equation, because if we do not match well, then we are far more vulnerable to negative outcomes in firefighter injury and death, civilian injury and death, and property loss. So we want to match well because we want to have positive outcomes in those three areas. Thank you so much for having me with you today. I look forward to our Q&A interaction. Thank you so much.